You ever watch a royal funeral attended by heads of states, cardinals, prime ministers, and wonder, what on earth is that guy doing there? The one in baggy cargo shorts, yelling at a soldier in Renaissance armor, like it's some Renaissance fair cosplay gone wrong. Well, that guy almost turned the Pope's funeral into an international incident. And the Swiss Guard? Oh, they were watching, waiting. And when the moment came, let's just say, justice wore a plumed helmet that day. It began, of all places, at the most sacred of gatherings, the funeral of the Pope, the kind of event where silence weighs heavier than stone, and even pigeons seem to hush their flapping. Cardinals wept in crimson robes, dignitaries sat like statues, and the crowd outside St. Peter's Square held its collective breath. And then there was him. He didn't belong. Everyone could feel it, the awkward energy radiated from him like a faulty neon sign at a candlelight vigil. Cargo shorts, a backwards baseball cap, loud sneakers with neon laces. Who dresses like that to a pope's funeral? But hey, fashion faux pas are one thing. Disrespect, that's a whole other level. He paced along the perimeter like a tourist who'd missed the memo that this wasn't Disneyland. He chewed gum, loudly. He recorded the guards, zooming in on their faces with that annoying smirk, the kind of smirk that says, and then of course, he spoke. Oh, come on, they're just standing there like wax figures. What's the big deal? Heads turned. Not many. Just enough to shift the atmosphere like a cloud drifting over the sun. Nearby pilgrims from Brazil frowned. An elderly nun clutched her rosary a little tighter. A mother whispered to her son in Spanish, "No mires al hombre grosero." And still, he kept going. Bet these guys just dress up for fun. What do you even do if something actually happens, huh? He was pointing, yes, pointing at one of the Swiss guards. A young man, barely 25, standing at attention with a halberd in hand and centuries of tradition on his back. Now, let's pause here. If you've never seen a Swiss guard in person, you might be tempted to laugh. The outfits? Michelangelo himself designed them, all puffed sleeves and radiant color. They look like toy soldiers if you squint, but that's the trap. Because behind the Renaissance fashion and ceremonial stillness are elite warriors trained in hand-to-hand combat, modern weaponry, and languages you didn't even know existed. But the troublemaker didn't know that. Or maybe he didn't care. The Swiss Guard remained motionless. That's their job. Dignity, after all, doesn't flinch at idiocy. "Hey," the man barked louder. "I'm talking to you, bro." Now the murmurs began. Not loud, but sharp. Disbelief, embarrassment, a low tide of murmured disapproval swelling through the crowd. And then, because there's always a then, he crossed the line. Literally. There was a short barrier separating the mourners from the ceremonial guards, a line painted white, symbolic, invisible but firm. He stepped over it. People gasped, as if watching someone tip a glass in slow motion right before it shatters. Still, the guard didn't move, but something shifted. Another guard, further along the line, subtly shifted his foot. A signal. You'd miss it if you blinked, but not if you were watching carefully. And there was someone watching carefully. An older man, further back in the crowd, not dressed like the others. A simple gray coat, worn shoes, eyes sunken but sharp, a scar tracing his jawline like a forgotten battle map. No one gave him a second glance. Why would they? He blended into the background, like an old painting on a cathedral wall. But his eyes were locked on the troublemaker, and on the guards. Especially one particular guard. The one who hadn't moved a muscle but whose knuckles had turned white around his halberd. The tension was now unmistakable. You could taste it. Thick, metallic, like the seconds before thunder. The man waved his phone, filming himself now. "Y'all check this out. Vatican guards all dressed up and nowhere to go." And then he said it. The line. The sentence that flipped the air inside out. Bet this Pope wouldn't care anyway. He's dead, right? Oh. No. Silence fell like a slab of marble. Cold, immovable, final. The nun dropped her rosary. A child started crying. Even the birds left. The Swiss guard didn't react yet. But someone else did. A voice, soft, barely above a whisper, but slicing through the silence like a violin string snapping. Step back. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't even a command. But it wasn't a request either. The troublemaker turned. "What'd you say, old man?" The voice again. "Step back. Now." It came from the man in the gray coat, the one with the tired eyes and the battlefield jaw. The troublemaker laughed. "What are you going to do? Hit me with your cane?" But the man didn't have a cane. He had nothing. Just his voice. And something else. Something in the way the Swiss guard nearest to him flicked his eyes just for a second toward the old man. Recognition. And that's when things started to shift. Slowly, deliberately, but unmistakably. The people who had laughed now stared. The guards who had stood still now leaned in barely. The disrespect that had once echoed across the square now recoiled into itself. Because something was wrong. Or right. Something different. And nobody knew what, not yet. But whatever it was, it had just begun. While the crowd gasped, their phones now lowered, and the laughter frozen mid-sneer, the troublemaker stood there bewildered. Still mid-rant, completely unaware that he had just poked a sleeping lion, one wearing silk gloves, but a lion nonetheless. The Swiss guard who had calmly blocked him just moments before had suddenly taken a single step forward, not rushed, not hostile, but it carried the weight of centuries. It was the kind of step that didn't ask for silence, it commanded it. The Vatican Square was suddenly so quiet, you could hear the banners flutter against the marble columns. Then, out of nowhere, a sharp voice cut through the air like a blade. "General Cult?" The voice came from behind the barriers. An older man, wrapped in a dark coat, trembling slightly, eyes wide with disbelief, had just spoken the name like it was a prayer or a ghost. The Swiss guard froze. The crowd turned. And the troublemaker, that poor, unfortunate man who just minutes ago was yelling about conspiracies and staged rituals, now looked like a deer in the middle of the road, realizing far too late what kind of train was headed his way. The guard slowly turned to the man behind the barriers, and for the first time all day, he spoke. His voice was soft, steady. "I haven't heard that name in 30 years. Suddenly, everything shifted. The weight of the man's silence all day, his presence at the Pope's funeral, the way even the youngest guards had subtly deferred to him, it all snapped into focus. This wasn't just some veteran. This wasn't a retiree with a good tailor and an old saber at home. This was General Lucas Cult, the man who, decades ago, had led the Vatican security forces through the worst crisis in their history. The one whose name had quietly been removed from public mention after a classified operation in 1994, which to this day still made younger guards lower their voices when it was brought up. The man who had saved a pope's life. The troublemaker, now visibly shrinking into himself, tried to mumble something about misunderstanding, about freedom of speech, or not knowing who he was, but it was too late. He had already played the fool in front of someone whose silence meant more than his shouting ever could. And then something else happened, something no one could have scripted. A young Swiss guard, barely 20 by the look of him, stepped forward. He was shaking, visibly emotional. He took off his helmet. His eyes didn't leave the general's face. "My father, he told me about you. He said if you hadn't covered his retreat in Sarajevo, I wouldn't be here." The general didn't say anything, just nodded, eyes a little wet. The young guard straightened up and gave him a salute so crisp, even the marble seemed to stand at attention. And suddenly, the air shifted again from tension to reverence. The Vatican funeral was still happening, but for this pocket of the square, time had stopped. People no longer looked at the troublemaker. He had become irrelevant. He was just background noise, now the kind that disappears once you realize you're listening to something worth hearing. All eyes were on the man who had stood silently through mockery and insults, only to be revealed not just as a legend, but as the kind of legend who didn't need to say it. The troublemaker tried to slink away, But the guard who had confronted him, the one who had refused to lay a finger on him, finally spoke again. "Stop." That one word felt like a commandment. The troublemaker froze. "You owe an apology," the guard said. "Not just to me, not just to the church, but to everyone who forgot that respect doesn't depend on knowing someone's name, but on not needing to." There was no yelling, no fight, just the quiet humiliation of a man who had barked in ignorance and was now being asked to whisper in remorse. The man, eyes lowered, voice cracking, finally said, "I'm sorry." It was clumsy, awkward, but it was something. The guard nodded once, and then, to the shock of everyone, he turned his back and walked away, dismissed, just like that. And in that moment, something truly rare happened. The crowd applauded. Not because there was a fight, not because someone was owned on camera, but because, for once, silence had shouted louder than chaos. As the bells of St. Peter's rang once more and the Pope's casket moved slowly toward its resting place, the general stepped back into the crowd. No spotlight, no fanfare. Just another man grieving a leader, standing with the faithful content in the shadows. A little boy nearby, who had been clinging to his mother's skirt the entire time, tugged at her sleeve and whispered, "Mom, was that a superhero?" She smiled softly, eyes still fixed on the old guard. "No," she said. "That was something better. That was a man who didn't need anyone to know who he was, because he already knew." And with that, the camera would fade to black, lingering on the guard's back as he disappeared into the sea of mourners, one anonymous soul among thousands, and yet, somehow, unforgettable. As the crowd slowly dispersed, the echo of the bells faded into the distance. The sun, now dipping behind the Vatican walls, cast long shadows over the cobblestones. The ceremony was over, but the true lesson of the day lingered in the air. In a world where noise often drowns out wisdom, where opinions are shouted rather than shared, and where fame often eclipses the true value of character, the Swiss Guard's actions spoke volumes. It wasn't just about confrontation. It wasn't about victory or defeat. It was about something deeper, about respect, about understanding that sometimes the loudest words come from those who never speak a sound. The general, who had once walked in the shadows, now stood as a testament to a forgotten lesson, that honor, dignity, and true strength aren't about how much you can shout, but about how well you can stand quietly, resolutely, in the face of everything else. The story didn't end with applause. It didn't need to. In the end, it was the kind of silence that spoke louder than any roar ever could. And as we reflect on this moment, one question remains. How many of us are walking quietly in the background of our own lives, waiting for the world to realize that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who don't need to tell you who they are? Pause for a moment of silence. Think about it. And the next time you see someone standing in silence, don't be so quick to judge, because you never know. They may be the hero you've been waiting for, they just haven't had the chance to speak yet.